everyone, I'm Matt, and welcome to the Good Trouble Show. In just a few minutes, retired Army Colonel Karl Nell will be presenting his talk on UAP at the SALT iConnections Conference, SALT's annual flagship Wall Street conference in New York City. SALT is a global investment platform connecting institutional asset owners with asset managers and technology entrepreneurs. It's basically a big Wall Street get-together. We're going to bring you the live stream of this along with a post-analysis from Dan Zetterstrom and Lester Nare. Making sure they're not on yet. Okay, good. Make sure they're not going any earlier. Anyway, but first, please hit the subscribe and thumbs up buttons on YouTube. Leave a comment and let us know what you think about this episode. You can also find us on Twitter at Good Trouble Show and all other social media sites at The Good Trouble Show. And of course, we are on all of your favorite podcasting platforms. We also need help keeping the lights on. You can become a supporter of The Good Trouble Show by going to www.patreon.com/The Good Trouble Show. And for the price of a coffee, you can support our work. Finally, Super Chats are open on YouTube and are another great way to support this show. I want to thank our Patreon and YouTube members, our chat moderators who volunteered their time, and all of you who are watching. Thank you for the generosity of your time. All right, our guests joining us today for analysis of today's presentation by Colonel Karl Nell are no strangers to the UAP topic. And here we go on your left. You have Dan Zetterstrom, the co-host of That UFO podcast and various media campaigns raising awareness around unidentified anomalous phenomena, and such as the pound UAP and UAP secrecy hashtag. On your right, we have Lester Nare, founder of the political group UAP Caucus. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us. How are you?
Doing well, Matt. Thanks for having us.
Okay, great. I'm just going to make sure that they have not started any earlier. It doesn't look like they have. All right, guys, how are you? So we threw this together literally about 2 hours ago. So usually we try to prepare a show a little bit more so than what we did today, but looks like we're up on the air, which is a good thing. And I know all of us are very excited to hear from Karl Nell. So I think this is going to be something else. So let's see here. So I'm going through my notes. So Lester, why do you think Karl? Actually, let me back up a little bit. Dan, tell us about Karl Nell. Who is Karl Nell?
Sure. So kind of a good summary that the majority of people that follow the UFO subject will understand is that Karl Nell is essentially David Grusch's boss. When David Grusch came out in the debrief article on June the 5th, 2023, with the article with Leslie Kean and her co-writers, they wrote Karl Nell was quoted as saying referring to Grusch, his assertion concerning the existence of a terrestrial arms race occurring sub rosa over the past 80 years focused on the reverse engineering technologies of unknown origin is fundamentally correct, as is the indisputable realization that at least some of these technologies of unknown origin derive from non-human intelligence. He has also said that Grusch is beyond reproach. Now, in terms of Karl Nell's career, he is extremely distinguished. It's been about 3 decades. He has studied as an electrical engineer, computer science engineering for the Air Force, a mechanical engineer, strategic studies. He started as the op officer at Space Command. He then moved to Lockheed Martin, senior systems engineer, where he was working on satellite communications. He also worked for the Defense Intel Agency in tech operations for Northrop Grumman. I'm sure everyone watching this is kind of ticking off all of these private defense contractors on their bingo cards. He was there for 13 years as Deputy Chief Technology Officer and Director of Systems Engineering and Integration. Then he became the Chief Strategy Officer for the U.S. Army Reserves. Then he kind of did some private industry work. And for the past 5 years or so, Karl Nell has served as the Modernization Officer to Vice Chief of Staff of the Army. One really interesting and noteworthy accomplishment by Nell while he was at his post was that he led systems engineering and integration and advancing to develop and connect sensors from all branches of the US Armed Forces into a unified network powered by AI. Those branches included Air Force, the Army, the Marine Corps, the Navy, the Space Force. So practically, what that means is if something in the sky shows up that doesn't have a signature, Karl Nell made the system that will notify each section of the US Army, the military, and alert them to collecting data on the device's signature. I think that's pretty big. He's the guy that would have seen stuff in the sky and would know if they're anomalous or not.
Yeah, he sounds like a complete underachiever. That's for sure. I think he needs to get after it and do a few more things, throw a few more things on his plate. I'm just joking, of course. I mean, man, what an incredible resume. Now, I had never heard of SALT before last year when I think it was Gary Nolan went on there. Lester, what can you tell us about SALT? What exactly is it, short of what I just kind of briefly explained in the beginning?
Yeah, no. So the SALT iConnections conference was originally started, by way of Anthony Scaramucci, who sort of wanted to create an incubator that brought together capital allocators, fund managers, and founders. So the intersection of all of the industries that make the sort of startup technology and finance sectors tick. And the goal of conferences like this fundamentally is to make deals, right? So they'll bring in speakers in a variety of what they believe to be the next bleeding edge topics that are going to be impacting their clientele, which again are some of the biggest capital allocators in the world, some of the greatest founders. And so this has been going on for over a decade. Only did we see last year the introduction of the UAP topic with Dr. Gary Nolan's talk, which I will state is still the #1 most watched talk that SALT conference has on their YouTube channel by a significant degree. I do imagine that Carl's will be equally as popular, but that's the general gist. It is really a networking event that is looking at where the intersection of finance, technology, politics, government, legal, all kind of come together to sort of look into the future and figure out how they want to allocate their investment.
That totally makes sense. Someone left a nice comment. They like your couch in the background, Lester. It does look pretty comfy. That's for sure.
We're getting there on the studio setup. Not quite yet, but we're making good progress.
I love it. From what I understand, this is like this conference is absolutely huge, and I don't have the other speakers that are part of this conference, which I believe is either a 2 or 3 day thing. But these are all absolutely enormous heavy hitters in the investment world, outside of the investment world. So what a great platform for someone like Colonel Karl Nell to come in and discuss what is really a very, very important topic. Dan, do you have any expectations as far as do you think we're going to actually hear a speech, or is this more? Do you think of just kind of a Q&A with him? I'm really not quite sure what we will get here.
Yeah, it's a really good question. At the SALT conference, Karl Nell presented a really thorough kind of slide deck that we didn't even get through the whole of. They came out after the fact. And there were some really compelling points in there, some really interesting points around control disclosure and catastrophic disclosure, as well as reimagining the Kardashev scale, and also, more importantly, letting people know that he was involved in drafting the UAP Disclosure Act that unfortunately didn't pass through to law entirely. Part of it did, but not entirely. So what I'd really love to see today in any form, whether it's a presentation or a conversation, but I'd love to see a conversation about how we can reimagine the UAP Disclosure Act for 2024, which will be in the 2025 NDAA, confusingly. But see how we can blow open this subject with the help of all these finances that are at SALT. All Karl Nell needs to do today is plant the seed of curiosity, and I think he's going to blow the doors off.
I certainly think he will. And I have here, I wouldn't mind just kind of taking a look at this, because one of the I think the most interesting things about his appearance at the SALT conference was his presentation, specifically regarding catastrophic or controlled disclosure. I know prior to being to go into this conference, I'd never heard of the term catastrophic disclosure. So I want to bring that slide up here, and Lester, tell us, maybe kind of walk us through here. You should be able to see that on your screen. What he meant by all of this, because I think it's really important. We're at, I think, a crossroads where we can't, I don't know, not necessarily rely on the government to be truthful with us on that. Of course, we're all trying to change that. But Lester, walk us through this.
Yeah, no, so I think there's been some interesting debate about what the actual definition of catastrophic disclosure is. And I think there's two camps that it kind of falls into right now. One is the idea that there's a non-government controlled disclosure, whether that's by way of a non-government entity or a foreign adversary such as a Russia or China, sort of beating the US to going public about our engagement with NHI. So that's like one lane. And then the other lane is the idea that it's the NHIs themselves that make their presence known in some kind of way that is sort of unavoidable. So those are kind of the two lanes of how people, I think, are falling on the line of what is the definition of catastrophic disclosure. But that presentation from the Seoul conference by Karl Nell, I think, is going to be similar to what we likely see from him here today for a different audience. And in particular, I think if you look at the slide from his presentation about the lines of effort, the way forward campaign, where he kind of broke down the timeline and a variety of different lanes, the way that he broke it down, you can almost see exactly the process they're going through from top to bottom. So if you think about this, public sector government, they started with trying to pass the UAPDA. Then as a follow-up to that, they then had that Seoul conference, which you're looking at both the sort of scientific research and the philosophical investigation piece. They kind of are doing both. And now what's next? Private sector. So for people who are sort of saying, like, why would Karl Nell be even at a finance conference doing this? I think the purpose is for that D line of effort, private sector, which is how can we get a distributed group of high net worth entities or individuals that can now begin to create the industry infrastructure outside of, for example, the existing defense contractors, for us to really begin to deal with what is going to be the post-disclosure process, which is necessarily going to require the best minds in tech, the best minds in finance and legal to deal with all of the aftermath that will arise. So I think we can sort of see, he's giving us his roadmap on the front end, so we can sort of see his decision-making process aligning with what he's already presented.
Dan, why do you think Karl chose this forum to have this conversation on UAP?
Yeah, so one of the things that really blew my mind about the Seoul conference that was put on by Peter Scarfish and Gary Nolan at the Stanford University was that it attracted people that weren't necessarily into the UAP subject in the first place. You know, what I like to kind of refer to as the muggles. You know, they're not the magic users. They're not the people that are knee-deep in this every day. They're people that are just a little bit curious about it and want a kind of almost a safe space to explore it academically, properly, without any risk to any of their reputations or their work or their livelihood whatsoever. So essentially, you're seeing today Karl Nell pitch to a room full of those people who aren't at this conference for UFOs, but they will fill this room out of curiosity because they want to hear what he has to say. If he is successful, he will come away with a whole bunch of conversations with people who have the means to affect this conversation going forward, to spread the curiosity, to actually get in there and do the work. So I think Karl Nell is here because he recognizes that fact and he recognizes the importance of private industry. Just look at the difference between what NASA and SpaceX are doing, and it kind of exemplifies the point. At SpaceX, we have private industry iterating faster without any of the governmental red tape that kind of holds development back. Whereas then you look at NASA, and they're struggling with their massive Boeing spaceship. It's just getting error after error after error. And I understand, again, it's a process of iteration. But each step takes so much longer inside government versus outside. So I think we're going to see these financiers come in and get their hands on this subject and see the opportunity for what it is. The first person to crack this open and to figure out the tech and commercialize it stands to make a hell of a lot of money. That's pretty appealing.
Yeah, that they do. Lester, what do you think the significance is of the business and community, the business and finance community, their interest in this? I would say that if all of this is a bunch of bunk, as you would hear from people like Mick West, you wouldn't have these sorts of financial power players on Wall Street here to listen to this presentation.
I think that's definitely right. And there's something happening. There's a backdrop of a change in particularly the venture capital industry, who are the people who provide money to a lot of the early stage technology companies that we all know and love, the Ubers, the Airbnbs, even the SpaceXs. In the venture community, historically, they have been very anti-defense. Right? So you have sort of the legacy defense contractors, the Lockheeds, the Northrops, the Boeings, and they've effectively run a monopoly on government contracts, particularly tailored to defense. That's actually shifted over the last, let's say, 5 to 8 years with the rise of companies like Palantir by Peter Thiel or by Anduril, founded by Palmer Luckey, both of whom now have significant government contracts and are the first of the Silicon Valley style technology companies to really lean into defense. And what we've seen is this year there's a big outfit called Y Combinator, which used to be run by the now CEO of OpenAI, Sam Altman. And if you look, every year they bring in a class of startups that they believe are going to be the next generation of great American technology. And if you look, they will usually give categories of what verticals they're interested in, and defense dominated this year's cycle. And I bring that up to show a reflection that what we're starting to see is generally the, again, new school Silicon Valley tech financiers as well as founders are very much now interested in the defense space and trying to figure out how can we get some of those juicy government contracts like the Boeings and the Northrops. As you see more of these new generation of folks start to come in, this is where the power struggle, I think, is going to begin to happen as they become aware that some of these companies may have these materials and were gifted them by the government without the opportunity for them to get access. So it's almost like the enemy is my friend kind of situation, where I understand a lot of folks don't want to see money and these types of people get into this space, but it is an inevitability. And ultimately, they might be the best positioned in terms of a war chest, in terms of political power, to jockey with the legacy contractors over the materials. So I do think the significance here is there's already been a sea change generally related to tech, finance, and defense. And then if you zoom in a lower level, I think that's where you're going to start to see more and more people you would see in a different context begin to now really poke at the UAP issue.
I just noticed here they just minutes ago wrapped up the last presentation with whoever that is, and here we go. Here's Karl Nell. We're going to cut right to it.
This evening, I'm glad that we are the final talk of this year's SALT event, and I'm very excited to discuss what I consider to be one of the most consequential questions of our lifetime, which is, are we alone in the universe? And I'm very lucky to have Karl Nell here joining me for this conversation. Karl, thank you so much for coming. And Anthony and AJ over at SALT, thank you so much for hosting this. So Karl, maybe to begin, can you share a little bit about your background, who you are, and perhaps why people should care what you say?
Sure. Well, thanks, Alex. It's a pleasure and honor to be here, and it's a fantastic event, and I'm glad to see a large bunch of folks that stuck it out to the end for this talk. So I was fortunate. I had a 4-year ROTC scholarship to Penn. I graduated with a degree in electrical engineering. The Army sent me overseas to do signal corps engineering projects, so I did a lot of strategic comm projects in Europe. I ended up working in Army Space Command. I commanded a satellite ground station, war trace to the Joint Chiefs. I spent some time at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. The Army ultimately sent me to get a master's in mechanical engineering, a master's in strategic studies, graduate work in computer science. I was on track to stay in, but I decided that I wanted to pursue more of a technical career. So I got out and ended up working at Bell Labs, which was a fantastic place. Unfortunately, I was there during the trivestiture that folks may be familiar with, where the company got split up. I left Bell Labs and ended up working in Lockheed Missiles and Space. I worked at Northrop Grumman. I've ran strategic technology programs in the defense industry, worked for a lot of the three-letter agencies, ultimately was a deputy chief of staff, or deputy CTO for a $2 billion company. I was a vice president general manager of a Northern Virginia-based R&D firm. I stayed in the military, in the reserve. I commanded at every grade level through brigade. I was fortunate to stand up the Army's newest expeditionary MI brigade. I was the deputy chief of staff for a combatant command. Ultimately, this experience sort of combined to give me the opportunity to come in and advise Army Futures Command, the largest reorganization in the Army Reserve since really 1973, on how the Army could be more effective. And my last assignment was involved with the UAP task force, which maybe is the most apropos for this discussion.
And so, Karl, here's the $1 million question. Do you believe that a higher form of non-human intelligence has visited this planet?
Right. So non-human intelligence exists. Non-human intelligence has been interacting with humanity. This interaction is not new, and it's been ongoing. And there are unelected people in the government that are aware of that.
And so, Karl, that is quite a bold statement. I'm wondering, and I'm curious, how confident are you that that is true?
There's zero doubt.
And Karl, what evidence have you seen? What was the moment where you developed this level of conviction? Because what you're saying is extremely consequential and very important. And I know that a lot of people here, even perhaps, may not believe that statement.
Right. Well, probably a better way to ask that is, how can the folks in the audience come to the, a common understanding of what this phenomenon is? And so there's sort of two tracks here. One is from first principles, and another is actually from the data. So let's take a look at the data. So we can look at some folks that have very high level access to information, like Paul Hellyer, who was the defense chief for Canada, has come out and said the same thing. We can look at Ham Eshed, the head of Israel's, or former head of Israel's Space Force, has said the same thing. Chris Mellon, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Intel, SAPCO, has essentially said the same thing. Lue Elizondo has said the same thing. David Grusch has said the same thing. David Grusch cleared for presidentially level material. So you're looking at people that are in a position to know this, and they're telling you the same thing. You could take a look at the Gang of Eight in the Senate and in Congress. So there's two members of the Gang of Eight, Marco Rubio and Senator Chuck Schumer, that signed up to the UAP disclosure amendment last year that basically said they're not being told the truth and we need to push forward on that. So that's sort of an overview of some of the data. From a first principles standpoint, what's so unusual about this realization? There's billions of stars in the galaxy. Life here evolved in 500 million years, which is basically a blink of an eye. We've found planets around every star that we've looked at. It's likely that the universe is full of life. If you look at the SETI program in particular, the SETI program has all the same assumptions that you would accept and probably make with respect to this topic, except that they believe that non-human intelligence is transmitting signals here. But at the same time, like, we're not transmitting signals. SETI doesn't transmit signals, and the only signals that are actually broadcast of high enough power into space for somebody to pick up come from broadcast television and ballistic missile early warning systems, which you could argue our technology is moving away from. We're going to satellite, we're going to fiber. Broadcast TV is a thing of the past. And if you get to some state where society is stable, maybe we don't need ballistic missile early warning systems. So the other guy is probably not going to transmit. But what the other guy may do is come here if that's possible to do. And there's physics models that suggest that may be possible.
And Carl, I mean, what you're saying is extremely consequential, and you've referenced other people that have said the same thing that also have similar credibility. There's similar reasons for why we should believe many of these folks, yet the government itself has not formally disclosed. They've been very reluctant to do that. Why? Why do you think that is?
So there's 6 basic reasons, and this, again, you could draw this out from first principles. There's a national security reason. There's the lack of a plan. There's the potential for societal disruption. There's the possibility that there's some non-public agreement. There's the potential for misdeeds and the desire to cover up misdeeds. And there's just the basic organizational intransigence and lack of priority that might be associated with the topic. So all these things are factors. The issue is that really the national security issue subsumes all the others. And so there's an opportunity maybe to contract the national security issue similarly to what was done with nuclear weapons and nuclear energy, such that nuclear energy is not necessarily classified and is available to the public. But lack of a plan and the potential for societal disruption are key ingredients that would prevent any responsible leader from coming forward with information that they don't have the means to address in a responsible way. It would be irresponsible to do that.
Okay, so what you're saying is that you have absolute conviction that a higher form of non-human intelligence has visited this planet, that there are factions within our own government that know about this, yet we still don't have a plan, and they may represent a security issue. This may pose a threat to humans, yet you still believe that we should disclose. Is that right?
Correct, right. So there's really 3 reasons that trump all those others. And those others are basically valid, like I said. So the first issue is the moral right. The government exists for and by the people. And so the nature of reality is fundamentally not government information. People have a right to know the world in which we live, and the pursuit of happiness requires that knowledge. So that's sort of the first kind of overarching philosophical foundation for this. But, as a corollary to that, if there are misdeeds that were done, then they need to be remediated. If there's lack of proper oversight, which is suggested by some of the whistleblowers, that needs to be remediated. So the first issue is the moral issue. The second issue is being in a reactive mode is never preferable to being in a proactive mode. So reactive mode is basically trying to prevent disclosure. But failing that, you might get a situation where you have catastrophic disclosure that creates all the problems that you were trying to prevent. So a more balanced middle path of controlled disclosure is the best way to do this, which is, again, an argument for some amount of disclosure. And the third part is simply societal advance and global competitiveness. More brain trust needs to be brought into this topic in order to make progress and to improve society. And so all 3 of those things together trump the 6 other reasons for non-disclosure.
And what do you think happens if we don't disclose? I know you mentioned this idea of catastrophic disclosure. Maybe disclosure may be forced upon us. How do you think about that?
So the situation is usually thought of as a binary state. It's like an all or nothing. And people have sort of argued this. But anybody paying attention realizes the government has already indicated that unidentified anomalous phenomena are real, they're not ours, and they're not our adversaries. The Pentagon has said that. Like, for people that are paying attention, like, that shoe already dropped. So for a lot of people, they think that the second shoe to drop is this is non-human intelligence, and maybe the conversation stops there. Like, the president comes out and says, there's non-human intelligence. The truth is that will precipitate this crescendo of other questions that maybe the government's not ready to answer, that will court, if not precipitate, potential negative ramification for society. And so as an example of this, I would actually point to something from the ancient past, the Bronze Age collapse. So Eric Klein, Princeton University, 2015, wrote a very interesting book called 1177 BC, the year that civilization failed. And so this is well known to current scholarship. Within a single lifetime, all of the very effective ancient civilizations of the Bronze Age failed due to a confluence of reasons that are not necessarily fully understood today. So we're talking about Egypt, the Hittite Empire, the Minoan Empire, the Manassean Empire, the Babylonian Empire. All these civilizations failed, never to return, other than, let's say, Egypt. And so these were highly sophisticated civilizations with highly developed infrastructures, highly developed administrative states. They were globalist, in a sense, very similar to today. In terms of the known world, the known Near East, they were economically interdependent. They had both diplomatic ties and commerce ties. And yet these civilizations failed in a single lifetime because of stressors that these civilizations collectively could not address within the time frame. And so if we look at our society today, one might argue that it's similarly fractured, similarly under economic stress, similarly under cultural stress as well, fractured and fragile diplomatic situation. It mirrors very much this scenario.
Yeah.
And so for a responsible decision maker, that is certainly a factor.
And so I guess when you say that, are you implying that perhaps we as a society may not be ready for disclosure? Or are you saying that we may not be able to defend ourselves against this other force?
So there's sort of different viewpoints on whether people are ready to deal with this phenomenon. And popular culture is kind of infused with this stuff. Roswell became a meme a long time ago. We got programs on ancient aliens, Skinwalker Ranch, all this stuff. I guess I would draw an analogy, though, for people that believe in a certain faith tradition, whatever that faith tradition is, and hold to that and subscribe to that in a very serious and devout way, and sort of pose the question, even for folks of that ilk, and I would count myself as one, if you're confronted with the reality of your religious belief system, like the reality of the metaphysical, an angel, a messenger from God, what have you, that's going to be a sea state change in your way of dealing with reality, right? Even though you already believe it, right? So it's one thing to believe and it's another to know. And I think in this context, this phenomena has the potential for an analogous effect both on the individual and on society.
Yeah, but do you think that the phenomena, this non-human form of intelligence, represents a threat to humanity?
So this is a good question too, and some of the other folks have sort of framed things in that light. And I guess I would suggest that if the universe is governed by conservation laws, and it's probably reasonable to assume the laws of nature that we understand apply everywhere. We may have incomplete understanding, undoubtedly we do, of these laws, but they're sort of homogeneous and they apply throughout the universe. And so those laws are governed by conservation rules. There's conserved quantities. And so this reality really forces a Darwinian type competition in order to survive. And so it's reasonable to assume any other civilization that's evolved has come up through the same Darwinian evolutionary process. So I think it's naive to expect complete altruism until and unless you get to a state of post-scarcity, where you essentially have no physical needs that we're kind of encumbered with in this universe. And so in some sense, it's the economics of the future that are going to determine whether there's cooperation, competition, or some kind of symbiosis, and inform the intention. But to assume either malintent or complete altruism, I think, is somewhat naive.
Yeah. So it sounds like what you're saying is it's impossible to know the true intentions of a higher intelligence. We may be competing for the same scarce resources. We may not be, right? We may be almost irrelevant to them, and they may be acting altruistically, although we cannot safely assume that. And so I guess I'm curious, if we continue down this disclosure path, do you believe that disclosure is inevitable?
So again, people that sort of look at this topic and study it, and there have been some good examinations on this from a historical standpoint, have realized that we're not in really a new state. This sort of disclosure emphasis has come and gone over time. And so this is not the first time we've arrived at this stage. I would suggest that maybe the peak of this current cycle happened last December with the Schumer amendment, and then it got rolled back, it was defeated in the House. And so it remains to be seen, if the process is going to continue. One hopes and can maybe draw a little bit of confidence that maybe this will come around is the colloquy that Senator Schumer and Senator Rounds had back in December. After their amendment got killed, they basically went on the Senate floor and articulated their rationale for the legislation. And I think Senator Schumer, to quote him, almost said it was a travesty that this did not pass. So this is, a bipartisan colloquy on a topic that I guess most people would probably consider fringe, and yet these two senators felt the need to do that and to double down on their desire to see this through.
Yeah.
So hopefully we'll see maybe a reintroduction of some version of that this summer with the goal of maybe putting it into the NDAA by the end of the year.
Do you think that it's imperative that the United States leads on the disclosure efforts?
So this is an interesting question too, because this is a global phenomenon and it's affecting other countries just like the United States. The reporting on this is clear over decades. Other countries have reported this stuff. And not only that, the Vatican has come out and made statements that reference or tangentially reference this topic. So organized religion has a say in this topic as well. So it's really a whole of planet, whole of humanity problem. And so the U.S. has got its role to play, but these other countries have their role to play, and it would behoove us to recognize that U.S. action could be preempted by another party, and it would be probably more conducive to work collectively.
Yeah, I think the one thing that I don't fully understand that I'd love to get your thoughts on, Carl, if we assume that a higher form of non-human intelligence has been visiting this planet, if we assume that some of the statements made by folks like Dave Grusch are true, that we have crash materials, and if we assume that those craft that we may have exhibit characteristics that defy our current understanding of physics, it would seem that that technology would provide an incredible strategic advantage to whatever nation ends up reverse engineering it first. And so, to me, that would imply that there is a race happening to reverse engineer this, and that this topic would be a top priority. Do you agree with that?
So I think some of what you say is a reasonable conclusion to be drawn, and I've suggested something similar in past statements. The point here, though, is to go from a pre-disclosure to a post-disclosure world, maybe two stable states that are separated by an unstable middle ground. And so how you make that transition, again, this speaks to the concern about this catastrophic disclosure. And this has come up in sort of arms regulation too. Mutually assured destruction, however much we don't like it, is sort of a stable kind of geostrategic regime. The Reagan era defense shield idea is also a very stable scenario, but to go from one to the other is very unstable.
Yeah.
And so this topic sort of mirrors that.
Yeah, and I know you and I were talking earlier about this idea that in order to really understand the phenomena, it's likely that we have to further our understanding of reality itself. And I guess I'm wondering, I can imagine a future where we acknowledge and we know that there is a higher form of non-human intelligence, yet we still don't truly understand the phenomena. We still don't truly understand reality. And so I guess I'm wondering, do you think that we'll ever truly understand what's going on? Or if part of the game, part of the journey, part of life itself is operating in an environment where at least part of it is fundamentally unknowable to us?
So it's a totally philosophical, epistemological question, right? Really about the nature of knowledge itself, right? Like, how can we know what we know and how can we be sure about what we know? I guess personally, I subscribe to the idea that there is an ultimate truth and that humanity being created in the image of a higher power is endowed with the quality to pursue an understanding of that. And so our part of our objective in this existence is to seek that out and try to understand that ultimate truth to a greater and greater degree. And this would be a component of that, obviously.
Yeah. Well, Carl, I really appreciate you taking the time to chat with us today. I'm hopeful and optimistic that together, maybe we can move the ball forward here and further our understanding of what is really going on, because I certainly agree with you. I think it is very consequential that we figure this out. So thank you again for coming. Thank you again to SALT for hosting us, and thank you all for listening. Bye.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Wow. I would say that was a pretty big mic drop.
Sometimes all you need is 20 minutes, huh?
Yeah. Yeah, I certainly wish that presentation were longer, but man, I would have to say that this was by far one of the most profound appearances by anyone that has visibility into the entire UAP topic. I mean, he spoke extensively at the very beginning about his, long list of credits. And, really the mic drop moment, in my opinion, was when asked, are we being interacted with by a non-human intelligence? He said, there is no doubt that NHI is here. Dan, what did you think about that?
It was mind-blowing. That was right out of the gate. We were wondering what he was going to say, how close he was going to get to that line. Last year, we had Gary Nolan say he 100% believes that, we are not alone. And that created waves in the community. So I fully expect to go onto social media after we finish this show, and everyone's hair is going to be on fire, and everyone's going to be inspired and running around and promoting the hell out of this. Today, Lue's book was announced, and Lue's book was called Imminent, the word of which came up here, is disclosure imminent. I thought that was really interesting. So today, it's been a great day for the UFO community. Not only are we seeing how this looks in a professional conference, but we're also seeing an outreach into people who aren't necessarily into this subject through Lue's book and through Karl talking to this group of people.
Yeah, and here's a image of the book. So this will be coming out August of 2024. Pre-order now. Imminent. Inside the Pentagon's Hunt for UFOs by Lue Elizondo. Of course, Lue Elizondo was the head of the Pentagon UFO program, ATIP, or the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program. Lester, what was your reaction to the bombshell statement from Karl Nell?
It's funny because when it started, I was thinking to myself, you only got 20 minutes, man. So, I know we want to give, and I thought it was important for him to give his background, because who is this guy? Most people in the room didn't know who he is or have any context at all. But to come off of that extended intro, and not equivocate on his position about the reality of an NHI presence, I didn't expect him to be that direct. Obviously we've seen a lot of times folks will kind of dance around it a little bit, and he did on some of the other topics, but I have so many thoughts and things to say, but in that environment, the room had people in it. He made the comment about how there's a significant amount of people there who chose to stay for, a later, it's the last talk of the day at 5 p.m. I am surprised that he was that direct. And again, this is another one of those now bookmarks in the story where we can now say the former head of the UAPTF for one of the memberships, I don't know if the leadership position, hierarchy, whatever, but one of the key members who would be in a position to know, not only because of that role, but all of his historical experience, is now unequivocally saying that there is an NHI presence here. And it's, like he said, not different than what people have been saying. It's just that this time around, we have a little bit more of a foothold. So I was really surprised that he was that direct, to be honest.
I certainly was as well. I think after him going through all of his qualifications, that just literally came out of left field. I think everyone was kind of like, yeah, and then boom. I mean, that was a mic drop moment if there ever was. Dan, he also mentioned that members of the Gang of Eight are well aware that the Pentagon has been lying to Congress, hiding all of this from Congress. What was your reaction to that?
I love that these people were mentioned. These are elected officials who are in office. And we did get a little mention of unelected officials as well, which he's highlighting because unelected officials should be held to account just as elected officials are. We can't let them run away with things. But we've now he's put a couple of flags on people, on politicians that people in that room will now go and speak to, and they will pressure. And when I say pressure, I don't mean they're going to call them up and yell at them, but they're going to say, what are we doing about this? How can I help? Is it a money problem? I've got that. That's easy for me to solve, you know? So we're going to probably see a few behind the scenes efforts come out of this where, you know, Rubio has been talking about maybe being Trump's running mate or going for president himself in the future. He's a member of the Gang of Eight that Karl Nell mentioned. Imagine having somebody in the White House, and put aside, you know, I wouldn't necessarily vote Republican, but it doesn't matter. This is a bipartisan worldwide issue, as Karl Nell was explaining. So if we end up with someone in the White House who will address UAPs without running away from the podium and do it seriously and talk to people about it, even if the answer is we don't know, that is a boon for the subject and a boon for the human race. We can finally get this party started.
Absolutely. Osap Rocky in the chat just said, "Happy Lue Elizondo Day, everyone." That's pretty true. My chat moderators, we have a group of volunteer chat moderators that keep the chat room clean, and they were sending a message during this that the chat was absolutely being inundated with debunkers and intelligence bots. We experienced the exact same thing when we had the episode about Lue Elizondo. And as the thing was going on, I was just looking at the amount of muting that had to happen, which is really, really pretty sad. If the debunkers and whatnot can't just sit and listen, that just tells you right away that the debunkers, people like Mick West and others, in my opinion, they have an agenda, and it is not getting to the truth. Okay, so moving on. So Lester, so one of the things he went through six sort of government reasons for the resistance to completely coming clean about this whole thing, and this is really for both of you guys for your thoughts on it. So he mentioned number one being national security, number two the government not having a plan, which big surprise there. I swear I think the government can't plan their way out of a paper bag. I mean, we certainly know that the Pentagon and the CIA are absolutely dysfunctional. He spoke about reason number three, which of course all of us have spoken about extensively, which is societal disruption. He spoke about possible, which we think are very likely, criminal misdeeds by people in the government in the past. And number four, well, I couldn't read my handwriting, non-public something, and then the last one, government something. My handwriting is kind of like a doctor's, so you can't really read it half the time. So Lester, maybe take a couple of those points and add your thoughts to that.
I just want to double click on how incredible that Karl Nell just sat and did what he just did. Like, I think we need to remind people that this is a guy who has hundreds and thousands of people who he's worked with, worked for, who've worked under him, who have an immense amount of respect for his intellect, what he brings to the table. And for him to sit there, of that six list, the one that's sort of really stood out to me is the non-public agreements, which, like, again, this has been something that's been a part of the lore for quite some time, right? That there is some form of established communication and as such some form of established understanding or agreement, which sounds so ridiculous as it comes out of my mouth. But Karl Nell sat on that stage and stated one of the core six reasons for not disclosing, which means he has reasonable suspicion to believe that there is the existence of said non-public agreements, I think is an astonishing public statement. Because who is making policy, political policy on behalf of the United States, and they're not elected officials and there's no system of oversight, among all these other things. But I thought that was fascinating. And just a couple other notes here is, I do like that he pointed out that national security basically trumps everything else because it just becomes so easy as a catch-all bucket. I think that was spot on. The repetition of that there's no plan in place, the amount of comments I get on my TikTok about, oh, it's Project Bluebeam and this and that, and it's a distraction from Israel, Hamas, or whatever it might be. We've seen, if you follow this issue closely, we know there's no plan in place. So hearing that publicly again was great. And just like the bureaucracy, the intransigence was the last thing that he said. But it's, no one wants to actually deal with problems right now in the US government, like whether it's about this issue or otherwise, unless it's going to get them airtime and get them funding for them to continue to run for elections. So there's just like not an incentive to deal with the problem, understandably. But anyway, the non-public agreement thing, I think, was eye-popping from that list of 6.
And that was something that David Grusch spoke about at the, I think it was the House Oversight Committee hearing coming up on a year, where he essentially said that elements of the United States government, I'm guessing the people, the 50-ish or so non-elected officials, senior executive service level people, have brokered agreements with whatever this non-human intelligence is, as crazy as it sounds for me, to me, for that coming out of my mouth. But that was something that Grusch had mentioned as well. And as Karl Nell mentioned, David Grusch was cleared for handling presidential level material. I mean, that tells you everything right there. Dan, what were your thoughts on or what stood out to you as far as the 6 reasons as to why the government is not coming clean about this?
Yeah, I thought a lot of these were really professional ways of, putting flags on things and saying you're not doing a great job with this. The last one there, the organizational kind of muckery that's going on. Essentially, he's pointing an arrow here, and he's saying they're not doing their job. They are not given the tools, and they are not directed to explain these things. They're directed to explain them away so that people can sleep better at night. And what's the point of that? We're just funneling money into a hole and not really doing our due diligence. Covering up misdeeds is always a sticking point. And Danny Sheehan often talks about this because obviously, if someone's been physically hurt in the past by anyone running these programs, killed or otherwise, and we've heard that people have been recently killed for these programs from certain outlets. Lue Elizondo brought it up just a couple of days ago with yourself, Matt. Those people should be brought to task. They should be punished. Yet the subtler part of that is that the people that gave those people orders might not be alive anymore. So what do you do with someone who's just following orders, right? And it might be a kind of an amnesty that has to come in, similar to apartheid in South Africa, where we have to essentially say to someone, hey, look, show us what you've been doing so we can stop you doing it again, and we'll let you off. And then there's kind of a give-take in society. It's cooperation. And I always say evolution is the survival of the most cooperative, not the fittest. The fittest is the most cooperative. I emphasize that. Then we have the lack of a plan and societal disruption. And I just wanted to touch on this because Lester brought up Bluebeam. And Bluebeam is this thing that gets trotted out again and again and again as this. The government are going to show us holographic aliens in the sky so that they can use it as an excuse to lock us in our houses. No, Bluebeam was never that. Bluebeam was specifically about showing certain individuals their religious idols to control them.
Right.
That, could be feasible, but that's not what showing people UFOs in the sky would be. It's a totally different thing. So let's just drop that phrasing and get away from it, because it was started by, Blavatsky, if I remember, decades ago, and there's no substance there. No matter how much a fan of Stephen Greer people are and things like that, it's not a thing. It's not there. So let's move past it. The national security one is really interesting because he brought up the atomic secrets. And I'm not sure if people know, but there's an Atomic Secrets Act of, I think, 1953, correct me if I'm wrong.
That's correct.
Where it basically locks down all the atomic secrets and says that the president can't act alone on these, Congress can't act alone on these. It has to be unanimous cooperation and decision-making. And yet, we have, nuclear energy that we're using in ways in the public for the benefit of us. They don't have to tell us exactly how that works for us to get the benefits. And I think that's exactly what Carl was getting at when he's saying, if there exists, essentially a power plant that can give us infinite energy and solve the world's energy woes, then let's get to it. You don't have to show someone inside of it and show them how it works. And this is where the private sector can bring money to bear because they see the opportunity. And I think today Karl Nell did a really great job communicating the opportunity that's there for everyone, the government, private sector, individuals, really effectively.
Absolutely. And yeah, I think for me, the thing that really stuck out of my head was his point that there just appears to be no plan. And I think from an outward point of view, or, looking out or standing outside, looking in as far as what the government has done, and particularly the Pentagon and the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA has been the portfolio holder of the UFO UAP national security problem almost from the get-go. And we have seen efforts by them time and time again to try and bury this as soon as, and Karl referred to this a little bit earlier, that we have had instances where we have gotten close to all of this coming back out, and the Pentagon and the CIA have managed to put the toothpaste back in the tube. Now, of course, that was a completely different time frame in American history. That was before social media, before cell phones, back in a time where if the government told the American people something, the American people believed it. They believed whatever the Air Force, the CIA, the Pentagon said, lock, stock, and barrel. We're at a different place today where we know darn well that you cannot trust a lot of what they are telling us. And we have seen, obviously, since David Grusch has come forward, a coordinated disinformation campaign by the Pentagon and the CIA to keep this tamped down and try to put this back in the tube. And overall, I think it points to a true lack of a plan. I don't know if it's out of just not wanting to confront the consequences or what. Lester, in your dealings, your organization, the UAP Caucus, of course, communicates with people on Capitol Hill. What are you hearing from members of Congress? Do they think that the Pentagon is being upfront with them? Do they think that this is just all one big issue of just not having a plan and the government not wanting to admit it?
I think generally speaking, the level of sophistication of understanding by most folks, both staffers and members of Congress, is nowhere near as high as it is for us on the outside. So that is a baseline starting point. It's some of this splits along party lines a little bit and is kind of reflective of the general zeitgeist moment in politics right now. But you tend to see on the Republican side, there's no hesitation to point at the deep state, the Pentagon, the CIA as not being honest and truthful and holding back information. So that's the default state, and it's almost everyone is there, particularly on the Republican side, without much cajoling. But for the Democrats, there is that semblance of like, yes, we're not being told the truth, but it's less, they still have the kid gloves on, if that makes sense. There's less of a desire to be combative about it or go to Matt over it. It's more so like, well, let's try to go through a process and let's ask, I don't think they understand that we're at the end, we're at the last chapter. We're not at the first chapter of the story in that context. And now is the time to take off the kid gloves, not sort of continue with that same process. So I think part of it splits a little bit along party lines, but generally, and that's more of a matter of degree, but generally across the board, there's a clear understanding that the truth is not being shared with Congress. And you do see more of a stronger understanding of this coming from the Senate Intel Committee, where I think we have the strongest, my view is there's the strongest understanding of the scope of the problem and also the most appetite to do something about it, which does make sense given the Intel Committee's remit in terms of what aspects of the government that they oversee generally. So they are both likely the most best positioned alongside the Armed Services Committees to deal with it. But that's just a little bit of the inside baseball. My view is currently, though, as is with every election season, there's only three priorities: winning elections, winning elections, winning elections. Right? Those are the three priorities. And as such, it's just I did find it interesting that Karl was hedged a little bit about the UAPDA 2.0 coming out later this year. Maybe it's because he's less hands-on involved than he was on the original version, or maybe they don't want to share the cards too early. It seems like we're going to get something along those lines out, but I did find his not being so confident about that actually happening to be something of interest.
I do too, and I would say as well, it's something to be be concerned about. Last year, as some people may not know, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer and Republican Mike Rounds presented the UAP Disclosure Act for inclusion in the National Defense Authorization Act. This piece of legislation was 63 pages long. It dealt with UFO crash retrievals. It dealt with biological entities. There was an eminent domain clause that essentially said if you were a private defense contractor, private aerospace contractor that is in possession of craft of non-human origin, that they had to give it back. I mean, it was a whole host of things. And really, I think probably the most important thing in the Schumer Amendment, is what it's often referred to, is it would have established a UAP advisory board within the executive branch composed of people appointed by the President of the United States. And it essentially operated from the perspective that any U.S. stakeholder that has, or any U.S. entity, government, private contractor that is a stakeholder in the UAP issue that possesses data, possesses records, whatever, had to reveal all of that to this UAP advisory board within the White House. And that advisory board was to be given complete access despite whatever level of classification that was applied to these special access programs. The board would look at it, decide whether it was something that needed to be declassified and shown to the public. Now, I know at the time, in speaking with members on Capitol Hill, that there was concern that it would inadvertently disclose some special access programs, perhaps not even related to UAP, that could inadvertently be disclosed that would have been catastrophic to the national security of the country. However, as folks had pointed out that were involved with this, there were mechanisms built in to make sure that didn't happen. And at the end of the day as well, the president had final say. So if the committee came to the President of the United States and said, you know what, it's time to level with the American public about the Roswell crash and the bodies that we have, et cetera, the President could have said on his own, you know what, it's too soon, too early to talk about this with the public, I'm going to veto it. And unfortunately, we had members in the House. This, from what I understand, had passed conference in the Senate, but then we had members of the House, particularly the head of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, Republican Mike Turner, who is one of the largest recipients of defense donations to his campaign, completely derailed the thing. So I would say, and I say this time and time again on the show, now is the time, especially since all of this is going to be coming up again with Congress. Now is the time for people at home to contact their representatives, contact their senators, contact their congressmen and women, and demand that Schumer 2.0, whatever that ends up being, be passed. It's time to level with the American public. And Dan, so one of the next questions that was presented to Colonel Nell was the reasons why disclosure needs to happen. And he mentioned three reasons. One, the moral right that we are a government by the people, for the people. And it is the moral right of the government to level with the American public that we are being interacted with by a non-human intelligence. It is not the government's place, let alone 50-ish non-elected officials and the CIA and the Pentagon, to flat out lie to the American public about this. And they have lied for decades, and they continue to. The second reason, which really resonated with me. Karl Nell stated that being in a reactive mode is never a good thing. It is better to be proactive. And then finally, he mentioned as well, which surprised me a little bit. The third reason he said that this has to come out is that there needs to be societal competition on this. In other words, people, and I've heard this from many places, that our government, and in particular the special access programs that have been trying to reverse engineer and understand these UAPs, these UFOs that we have in our possession, they are not having any luck figuring it out. So God forbid this whole UFO thing is an existential threat to humanity. We need all of the best and brightest, no matter what country they are part of, working on this to solve it. So Dan, out of those three reasons, what really resonated with you with what Karl Nell said as far as why it is time for us to, why it is time for the government, the CIA, the Pentagon, to just come clean and lay all the cards out on the table?
There was a wonderful moment during this talk where Karl Nell mentioned the memification of Roswell and what's happened to it. And when you look back at that, you know, anyone that knows the UFO history knows that Roswell didn't make a splash immediately. You know, even though the headline went around the world that they'd found a saucer, you know, via radio and all the kind of the slow motion news cycle they had back in those days compared to now, it didn't make a big splash until like the 60s, 70s when it kind of really got running. And things just take a while in that setting to kind of propagate to the human race. You do that now, in these days, within 10 minutes, you know, people on islands on the other side of the world are reading the headlines on their smartphones. And if there happens to be somebody that reads it that has a novel idea, a novel approach, just a new way of thinking about this problem, it reaches them and they can engage with it now. So I wonder if what Karl's getting at, where he's saying, you know, there's more brain trust that we can bring into this, is the fact that media has a bigger reach now. Science has a bigger reach now. You know, before, someone with a little bit of technology wouldn't be able to communicate in real time with someone on the other side of the planet who's looking at scans down to the the atomic level of what this material is. Now, Dr. Gary Nolan at Stanford could scan it, get it over to someone within 30 minutes, and they could be studying this on an expert level. So there's a lot to be learned here. But also it made me think about what Karl brought up just a second after this, where he spoke about the Bronze Age collapse. And a few years back, I went traveling in Mexico, and I got to experience the culture and the stories they tell there about the Spanish coming over and the British coming over and how they kind of passed those. And it's safe to say that, you know, the societies in Central and South America were reactive, not proactive to that problem. It came over the horizon, and then they started dealing with it. But as well as that, the way that it went isn't necessarily how the broad strokes of the story go. It didn't wipe out whole civilizations. What it did was transform them. And if we can control that transformation in a sensible way from both sides, and both sides are fully engaged and fully aware of what the issue is, there's a lot to gain from meeting another species or another civilization. It will change us down to the very core. And we need to have our brains switched on when that transformation begins to happen so that we can kind of mediate it. You know, Facebook came out and look at what social media has done to us as a civilization. We need to be more switched on than we currently are. And Karl's call for more brains on this issue, I think, was kind of touching on all of those points to really drive home that this is a humanity problem and the whole of humanity should be engaged in it, not passively just reading headlines.
And Lester, he spoke about as well about civilizations that have failed to quote stressors that it could not handle, and drew comparisons to various civilizations in the Bronze Age, I believe, and others. And essentially he was saying that much in the same way that we have mutually assured destruction with nuclear weapons, that it is in a sense a place of stasis, and much in the same way that you have not talking about this and not knowing about it, that we are at a point now where our civilization has to come to terms with this. As Dan just pointed out, this isn't just an American problem. This is a worldwide issue that deals with all of us as a species. What were your thoughts on that, Lester, as far as we are really at a point where we cannot continue to bury our heads in the sand about this?
I did think it was interesting that he chose to draw the parallels the way he did to, the Bronze Age collapse, as well as the transition from a pre-mutually assured destruction era to a post-mutually assured destruction era, where there was that period of instability, which he was talking about. And that's kind of, I think, when we talk about, let's say, pre-disclosure, post-disclosure, it's not like a light switch where on Tuesday we're pre-disclosure and then on Wednesday we're post-disclosure. There is this period of uncertainty, right? Once this comes out around things like the power dynamics, again, the financing, the legal, the IP, the societal, religious, philosophical, social, like all of those things all happen at the exact same time as soon as we go into a quote disclosure moment. And our current ability to deal with problems that are much more grounded, that are much, in theory, easier to solve, but our complete incapability of being able to solve them, just in general politics, I think is kind of what he's referencing here, where it's like, we're like out of shape as society, right? And we're not in a position to be able to actually deal with the real reality of this stuff, just kind of where we are now. And so there's this need for us collectively, right, to be to try to position the way in which we have political dialogue, cultural dialogue, individual familial dialogue, like all of these aspects need to be in alignment. And because I think the fear is, right, you have disclosure happen and then we're ill prepared for it, and then it precipitates civilizational collapse, right, by doing so. And I don't think that that's a non-zero issue, particularly with the amount of instability that we have globally in this exact moment, in the sort of South China Sea, Taiwan, China, Israel, Hamas, Iran, Ukraine, Russia, and generally speaking, the shift from the US being the world's global superpower to this multipolar world where we have the rise of China, rise of Russia, the global South kind of no longer buying what the West is putting down. Like all of those fractures create a backdrop with which disclosure becomes more difficult to make it through that transition that Karl Nell is talking about. So I think it's recognizing the context of the environment we're in right now and realizing we have to solve all of those other problems, not solve, but we have to contextualize them and understand that, there's a strategic difference between how China and the US are viewing this issue right now based on that geopolitical dynamic that I just mentioned. China's in a position right now where if they were to go out first on this issue, they have a momentum around global buy-in, particularly when you talk about the global South, where they might then be able to utilize that to create an even faster acceleration in terms of acquiring power opposite that of the US. I don't want to get too sort of geopolitical here, but there's real world serious dynamics here that I think base his idea around the possibility of civilizational collapse to be a realistic thing given the level of instability we currently have globally.
Can I just add there as well?
Please,
that
yeah.
I think all those points are amazing. And as you were talking, Lester, I was thinking about the current conversation around AI as it's emerging now. This is what we're seeing.
Exactly.
Who has the power for it? How are countries going to engage in war using AI? How are they going to use it on their own citizens? And these ethical questions are coming up. And of course, as always, ethics is relative. My ethics is different to Amazon's ethics, is different to the government's ethics. And what we think of as success in those areas is different. So we need to start those conversations now. Otherwise, we could see where there's something in kind of astronomy where we speak about something called the Great Filter. And that is one of the solutions to the Fermi paradox. The Fermi paradox says, okay, if life is out there, where is it? Why aren't we seeing it anywhere? And one of the solutions or proposed solutions to that is that, well, then there must be some kind of filter for civilizations that stops them getting kind of past certain things. And I've always thought that saying there's a great filter is kind of a misnomer. There are countless great filters that societies have to reckon with every single day, every single moment of their existence. And this right now is one of our great filters. Can we come together and get past it? Or are we going to just be slinging mud at each other?
I absolutely agree. Now, one of the questions that I thought Colonel Nell was very careful in how he answered was a question from the host that essentially said, can we defend ourselves? Is this a threat? And Carl went into sort of a bit of a discussion about the laws of nature and the laws of conservation. And kind of my takeaway from it is that good and evil is a universal truth. It's not something just specific to Earth. It exists in the galaxy. The yin and yang, and that I think was when he spoke about this, the laws of nature, and he also mentioned as well that we do not know the intent. Yeah, Dan, what are your thoughts on that? I mean, I think that was a fairly significant statement that was kind of hidden in a bit of a longer explanation, but I think it's really important.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's hugely important. Fact is, we don't know. And when people talk about this threat narrative that is drawn around UAP, we're not saying they are a threat. We're saying we don't know, so we have to act as if, on the off chance that they shoot, UAP lasers or whatever at us, we need to be able to be mindful of that and defend ourselves before that happens. It's that reactive versus proactive thing again. And when you look around at humanity, depending on what kind of person you are, it will change how you see the world. But is humanity malicious or is it altruistic? I think the real response to this is to recognize that every person is an individual and we all have our kind of different approaches. The original idea behind the story of E.T., the friendly alien, was that he was one of 5 different aliens accosting people in a farmhouse. Definitely inspired signs later on down the road. You might have thought that. But, early on, back when that was made, there's Steven Spielberg, who has a lot of conversations about this kind of stuff, and was one of the first people to flag up the aerial school experience and things like that. He's leaning into the fact that there is a spectrum of behavior in all life. And depending on how you value life depends on whether you think that is evil or whether that is good. When really there's duality in all things. And we kind of have to hold that, but not be naive about it. It's not right to say that every other species in the galaxy is going to come here and be throwing up peace signs and saying, we come in peace. But equally, not every species in the galaxy is going to be coming here and asking for our resources. They might want to work together. So we have to be mindful of this. Otherwise, we might miss the opportunity through our naivety.
Lester, do you think that this presentation by Karl Nell will have impact on members of Congress?
I'm not. I don't know if I'm on board with that interpretation necessarily, and I also don't think that was, from Karl Nell's perspective, his intent either. I do think this will end up making the rounds. People will get a couple of emails. Maybe they'll take a watch. But as a practical matter, I don't think that members of Congress will hear anything from that talk similar to us on this call if they're aware of the issue and will necessarily move the needle. And even for those who are unaware, I think given the scale and scope of all the things that are going on, it'll sort of be a similar like, oh, I think someone else is handling that, or it sounds similar to what we've already heard. So I do think that is potentially going to be some of the general reaction. I do think that within the business community, both finance and tech, I do think this will start getting passed around in Slack channels, in Microsoft chats, in G chats, as people are just like, hey, did you see this thing at this tech conference? Like this guy from the government came in. So I think, and this was my perspective going in as well. This is going to be something that unlocks a new demographic that hasn't really engaged in this issue in any substantive way, and give them an on-ramp to then be like, okay, I want to know more about this UAPTF or this legislation that he said that Schumer did, or any of the other kind of breadcrumbs that he dropped. I don't necessarily see it being a huge changer of the status quo for members of Congress. But what I will say is it does add to the corpus of material of the increasingly direct statements from the cohort of former government officials in a position to know. This is, again, like we mentioned earlier, this is probably the most, Lue hasn't said something this direct. David Grusch has intimated similar things, so he's the closest. Chris Mellon certainly hasn't gone that far yet. We've only heard one interview from Jay Stratton. He hasn't done so. Colm Kelleher, Jim Lukatsky. None of these folks have really done so in this way, in this forum. So I think the significance is more going to be on that new demographic versus members of Congress. But that we could be wrong there. So we'll see.
How much, you spoke earlier about kind of a lack of appetite to deal with this on the Democrat side. How much of that is due to having a Democrat president in office?
So this is a great question. I think that's part of the equation. I think the folks around Biden have decided that they're trying to go for a path of least resistance administration this cycle, and they're keeping it very tight in all arenas, UAP or otherwise. So if you're looking from a top-down perspective, there's no appetite to do anything that's avant-garde right now, unless it falls in like specific line like the student loan, forgiveness, or the rescheduling of marijuana, like something that has a clear electoral like impact. If it doesn't, they're not doing it. So that top-down like position, because they're on the defensive and they feel under siege because Trump's coming, I think does impact the Democratic caucus as a whole, like engaging in any number of things that are outside of that box. So I do think that that's part of the equation. I think another part of the equation that it shouldn't be underestimated is the internecine warfare between Republicans and Democrats, because more Republicans have been out and vocal about this, and they have political personalities that people have strong opinions about. As such, a lot of Democrats will hear it and then say, oh, well, I saw something with somebody that they find distasteful or don't have respect for, talking about it on some news channel that they don't like and don't favor very much, and then immediately then shut down the entire topic in their mind because, oh, the crazies on the other side are what's looking at it. So I think it is both top down and also the sort of the crossfire of the perceived political positioning of being associated with a topic that people on the other side that they view as rebel rousers or whatever are associating with. So I think those are definitely part of the calculus here.
Dan, I had a note here towards the end, and I'm scribbling frantically, and I'm not sure if this was a statement or a statement by Karl Nell or a question from the host, and that was there is a race to back engineer these crashed craft. Do you recall exactly what? Can you decipher my horrible note taking?
Yeah, if I remember correctly, Nell had said something that kind of implied that this race could be real and would be a sensible thing to assume given the facts that Nell had relayed during this conversation. And I think that's absolutely true. You know, there was about a year or two ago, there was a really wonderful program called Debris. And it was kind of like just imagine like a police procedural show, except it was all about the black market trade of UAP technology. And it kind of flew under the radar. But Andy and I over that UFO podcast had a few conversations about it at the time, saying, could this be real? Is this sensible to think it would be happening? And countries have sent SEAL teams and things like that into each other's kind of borders over much lesser things than something that could give them such a leg up that they would almost look like a breakaway civilization to the rest of the planet. So I think that's absolutely a viable possibility, that this has been going on right under our noses. And we could look back across decades, and maybe part of why this doesn't, the government doesn't want to talk about this is because we'll see maybe an emerging of these operations where they've officially sanctioned going to steal something from another country under the guise of something else. As I said, I can't kind of speak whether it's definitely real or not, so please don't kind of go run into any officials and say, the US came and took our stuff. All I'm saying is it's a very realistic possibility, and it would be sensible, I think, to assume that countries are doing this to each other.
Absolutely.
Can I double click on a quick point there?
Yeah, please.
Sorry,
please.
I just want to quickly double click on something because I think this is an important distinction. In the course of the speech, we talked earlier about how when Carl originally stated the statement about NHI is here and it's unequivocal 100%, he was very direct, and it wasn't equivocating or kind of hedging in any way. The reverse engineering question, it was not the same level of directness. He kind of said that would be a safe thing to assume is true, which is not the same thing as saying that, yes, I, from my own position, know that to be the case. And I think it's important to make that distinction, that he wasn't really, he was saying that in theory, hypothetically, yes, you can draw those conclusions, but and this seems to be the case across the board, everyone seems to be talking and addressing the NHI presence without really trying to touch the reverse engineering piece or being very delicate about it. And that's partly due to not wanting to want to run afoul of security things and like not wanting. So I do find it interesting that it's like, we want to talk about the presence, but as soon as you start getting like, what about the programs? The water gets a little murky, and then it becomes, intelligentsia and academic. So I just wanted to make that note that I do think there was, and we can listen back to it later to see, but I do think it wasn't really direct like his other statements, which I think is a meaningful thing that he chose to not be direct about the reverse engineering.
Absolutely. And I can tell you from what I've been told by multiple sources is that the subject of the crash retrieval program, that is literally the third rail that would land somebody that was read into that program, would land them in jail. So I can certainly understand why Colonel Nell, if he indeed was read into those sorts of things, why he would have to be extremely careful in his wording and in how he spoke about that. And and I just want to point out here, Dan, you provided this really great kind of background on Colonel Karl Nell, and I want to read some of this off because when you listen to Colonel Nell and what he said today, and the unequivocal statement that non-human intelligence, not from here, not from China, not from Russia, has been here, is here, and is interacting with us, and it just, what it does is it validates pretty much everything Lue Elizondo has stated. It validates everything that David Grusch has stated and multiple others. But I just want to, again, recap some of Colonel Nell's background here. And this just gives you an idea that what you hear Colonel Karl Nell talk about publicly, you can take that to the bank. So what you wrote down here was, he has an extremely distinguished 3-decade career in the military, studied electrical engineering, computer science engineering, mechanical engineer, strategic studies. He was an operational officer at Space Command. Dan, you noted here, he was a Lockheed Martin senior systems engineer for satellite communications. He worked in the Defense Intelligence Agency for technical operations at Northrop Grumman. He was there for 13 years as a Deputy Chief Technology Officer and Director of Systems Engineering and Integration. He was Chief Strategy Officer for U.S. Army Reserves. He was Vice President of ENSCO, a space and manufacturing company that led a geographically dispersed R&D division of 100 employees that provided disruptive technology solutions to the Air Force Technical Applications Center, Department of Homeland Security, the National Defense Threat Reduction Agency, the FBI and the Pentagon Force Protection Agency, and other elite national security strategy clients. He was the Director of Special Programs for U.S. Africa Command, one of 11 outposts. For the past 5 years, Colonel Nell has served as the Modernization Officer to the Vice Chief of Staff of the Army. He led systems engineering and integration advancing to develop and connect sensors from all branches of the U.S. Armed Forces into a unified network powered by AI branches to include Army, Air Force, Marine, and Space Force. I mean, all of this tells me that you can absolutely take to the bank everything that Colonel Karl Nell said, that UAPs, UFOs are here, and that there is a non-human intelligence here interacting with all of us on Earth, and it's damn time our government come clean about it.
100%. You can take any individual line item that you just walked through. Do you understand how hard it is to be a CTO at Northrop? I don't think people understand the level of professional success that you need to consistently execute on over a 30-year period to have that resume, right? It's mind-boggling to me as someone who comes from a technology background, right? And we're fundamentally, when we talk about the reverse engineering stuff as an example, we're fundamentally talking about science and technology in theory, right? So you're going to want to have people who have technical context and expertise at the highest level as sort of your conduit to understand what's going on the inside. You couldn't write a fake version of the ideal person almost any better than Karl Nell for this sort of context to be one of the people trying to represent a former government employee coming forward and trying to move the conversation forward. Again, this goes back to what I said earlier. The people in the DC Beltway within defense contractor spaces, not our network, but the network of the sort of political class, some portion of them are going to have a historical reference point for who this guy is and why he's so important. So when they hear Colonel Nell just did this talk and they listen to it, they're going to take it to the bank, just like you're saying. And those are going to be people who are potentially still in positions of power within the structures of whether it's the military, the intelligence community, etc., that again are going to drive more and more of the pushback from the inside by someone they all either look up to, have huge respect for, he's mentored them, he was their mentee, whatever it might be. I mean, that's a long resume with a lot of entities that are relevant and important to the subject that we're talking about.
I absolutely agree. Folks, if you're enjoying this show, we would absolutely appreciate a thumbs up, a subscribe. If you're viewing us on any other social media, such as Twitter, which we're on, Facebook and elsewhere, of course, we would appreciate a follow. And I would like to get to some of the questions from some of the folks in the audience here. Rick Roberts, thank you very much for the Super Chat donation. Rick asks, when he says NHI, non-human, couldn't that also be in reference to AI, artificial intelligence? Dan, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, the AI it's been passed around as a possible solution to the machines that we're seeing, the technology of unknown origin. It would make sense, that if we were to send something to an exoplanet, God knows how many light years away, that would have some form of AI so it could self-manage itself whilst there. Right now, we send these slow radio waves. People might have seen a couple of weeks back that NASA engineers were amazingly able to wake up Voyager and correct an error that was happening in one of its chips. Imagine, troubleshooting anything is hard enough. Imagine doing it with a microscope and you're only allowed to point at an object that's billions of miles away from you. It's impressive. Sorry, Matt, repeat the question one more time.
Oh, yeah. So the question was essentially when he says NHI, non-human, could that also be in reference to artificial intelligence?
Yeah. So with science, we work with what we know. If we know that we do it, we can unequivocally say, well, then it's possible someone else would do it. We're making AI now. We're starting to have the conversation about general AI now. So it's absolutely important that we understand that, and we understand that something could be sending something here, whether it's avatars, whether it's a ship, whether it's a mix of those two, that could possibly be so advanced that we wouldn't be able to distinguish the difference between AI and a biological life form.
Let's see, David Smethurst, what does the panel think this means for the Arrow historical report and the DoD backing for it? And I think what Dave is talking about here is the upcoming second UAP historical report. Lester, what are your thoughts?
I think maybe the only thing I'll say on this is I think it's interesting that, Karl Nell, even after the part one of the Arrow historical report came out, still chose to come out and double down, right? And basically say what Arrow was talking about is BS. That's basically what he said. And it'll be interesting to see because now Director Tim Phillips is the new director at Arrow. So it's under new leadership, so that might change the dynamics. Another important point, and someone in the chat will reference this, but Ronald Moultrie's replacement at USD is now coming in for confirmation hearings, who would ostensibly be the boss of Tim Phillips and report directly up to the Secretary of Defense, the Deputy Secretary of Defense. That it's a woman whose name's escaping me. I apologize. There's just so much information. But that when you change leadership, there's a change in perception, a change in how you want to navigate the situation. So who knows that the combination of stuff like Karl Nell coming forward like this, the new director at Arrow, I don't think there's going to be anything different, but it is a factually different thing, as well as the new leadership above within the DoD could change the dynamics for a part two. And again, the other angle to this is if this is a directive coming down from the Biden administration, which we've heard, someone suggest as such that effectively the Biden administration explicitly does not want to disclose, and as such, the DoD is told to shut all this down. If that position changes, then all bets are off. That they could try to do an about face. I don't believe that's going to happen. But I don't know that the Nell presentation will impact the Arrow historical report, but these larger changes around leadership related to Arrow may ultimately have said impact.
Dan, what are your thoughts on that?
I think in a practical sense, if I was to give someone a 60-page document versus a 20-minute video, they're going to watch the 20-minute video. So they're going to be listening to Karl Nell over whatever it says in this document. Sad fact of the world is that less people read now, and most people don't sit down to kind of read these really dry reports, especially when they don't think that Arrow has any authority. The lady, Lester, by the way, that you were referring to, Tonya P. Wilkerson,
yes.
And she was the deputy director of the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, which means that she was a few tiers up from Grusch. So anything Grusch could see, she could see. So we could be about to see someone take over that has a much better idea and a much bigger willingness to discuss it than what we've previously seen from Moultrie, who, he can be argued to have obfuscated the conversation a bit when he was in a hearing, unfortunately.
Yeah, I can tell you. I can tell you for a fact that Ronald Moultrie refused to be briefed. Refused to be briefed on the UAP UFO issue prior to the hearing. He asked to be briefed after he was done testifying to Congress. So take that how you want to take that.
Even he doesn't want to read. Look at that.
Yeah, exactly. And the individual that you're talking about, Tonya Wilkerson, that is taking the head of OUSDINS, I would say to any member of Congress that's watching this, she is somebody that you want to subpoena. Trust me on that. Just trust me. She is somebody you want to subpoena, put under oath, and ask some very specific questions. Okay, moving on. Let's see here. Craig Witten. Craig Witten, thanks for the super chat. We all have a role to play here, folks. It is hard to talk to friends on this because of the stigma. I get it, but we must get used to our new reality here, and we have to help each other do so. I completely agree. Craig Whitten also said he ran out of characters, but sincerely, thank you, Matt, Lester, and Dan, for their work on this matter and sharing with us. You're very, 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 very welcome.
Thank you. Can I just touch on something there that he highlighted?
Please. Yes.
About talking about this issue, and Lester touched on it a little bit there. Karl Nell today talked about this in a stellar way. There was a little bit towards the end where the discussion came up of, in order to understand the phenomenon, do we have to understand reality itself more? And there was a little bit of discussion on it, but there were no hard facts there. There was just an enjoyment about speculation. And I think it's important to remember that we can separate these conversations. You know, once you've sold someone, NHI are real. You've opened the conversation with that. Their head's exploding. So if we currently then start talking to them about consciousness and the nature of reality, it's a lot, and you're going to see people's eyes glaze over. Yes. So it's better to just drop that little seed of curiosity and then let them ask questions and lead the conversation. How we communicate about this is really important. Less is more. Someone gave me a really good quote in university. I can't remember who he was quoting, but he said, "Perfection is left when there's nothing more to take away." And I think that applies to conversations on this subject as well. Keep it basic. Don't run too far with it. Wait till someone comes back to you and says, "But what does this mean for consciousness?" And then you can say, "Well, what is conscious?" You know, you can have those conversations, but let them lead. Be a little conservative and let them kind of just get used to the warm water, because if they've never felt warm water before and they don't even know that water warms up, it's going to be a bit of a paradigm shift.
I absolutely agree. That Dan, you took the words right out of my mouth. Gary Nolan has even mentioned something along the same lines. But messaging on this to people that don't track this topic, it is a difficult subject to speak about without people immediately going to all of the tropes and tinfoil hats, little green men, and to have a serious discussion about it is challenging. But I've always felt that this needs to be handled in a very careful, planned manner. You just can't vomit the whole thing out. So, all right, moving on here. Bill Lacey, thank you for the super chat. The reality is stop lying and tell us the truth, period. Less double talk. Bill Lacey, again, thanks for the super chat. The only question we should be asking, why were we lied to, and why are they here? Wow, those are two very good questions. Lester, what do you think?
I mean, the why were we lied to question is kind of like Colonel Nell referenced, is going to open up an enormous can of worms. If the core story is to be believed, that we've had these materials for decades, they've been squirreled away in programs, and people have been emotionally and physically abused as a way to make this go away, the court system is going to be filled with lawsuits related to all of that. And there's going to be a lot of them, given, the alleged sort of trail of destruction that this has caused historically. So it's a great question. And, part of, again, the reason, and I think in the 6 reasons why this has not come forward, the misdeeds was one of the things Karl Nell stated, and he recognizes the same thing, because how do you do a judgment on what the cost is, and what do those numbers actually look like? I mean, you could be talking about the U.S. government being liable for very large sums of money related to this subject as that kind of plays out. So it's going to be, and then the why are they here question is potentially an unanswerable question. Potentially. And I think we need to be open to that fact. And that's kind of what they were alluding to at the end of the talk, which is, how do you really know that you are accurately interpreting the intent of something that is so far? I mean, we have this issue currently in existing AI models, large language models of this. We can get the output, and we know that the output is good, but we're getting better at it, but we don't really quite get the mechanics of how the neural nets work to give us that output. And that's something we built, right? So let alone, a completely different species with a whole different context. Those are two fundamental questions. I think they have some of the largest implications for the subject, both from the government liability side and the, long journey it's going to take to really characterize what the phenomenon is, and then subsequently, how do we view it as altruistic, a threat, somewhere in between. It's going to get very complicated.
Absolutely. So Dan, there is, as Lester alluded to, there's really no way that we will ever have 100% intelligence penetration with this non-human intelligence and understanding why it's here, what it wants from us. And that goes back to what Colonel Karl Nell was speaking about, as well as David Grusch in the past, about possible agreements that have been made between elements of our government and whatever non-human intelligence is. For you, does that raise alarm in not knowing what was agreed upon if we don't even, A, we weren't even told about it, and then B, we cannot have intelligence penetration, 100% penetration, as to understanding exactly what their intentions are and what the agenda is?
As Lester said, these are really big fundamental questions. And what we can insinuate from an agreement is that a need was expressed by the others when that agreement was being made. What that need was, we don't know, but there might be paperwork somewhere, that someone signed something. But all we can work with is the data, and the data might give us some answers to the two sides of those questions. So, for example, we know there are people in recorded history who have experienced what they call abductions, and they've been taken and had various experiences. Now, if the US government came out and just made an announcement that says, hey, something's here and your walls and locks don't matter anymore, and it can take you out of bed in the middle of the night and impregnate you and come back and take your baby, already I'm getting to a space where, one, it's absurd, and two, it's very scary. So I can see a scenario where the cover-up has some kind of subtle justification. However, whether we agree with that justification, whether it's suitable for us all, whether an agreement that was made in the 40s even applies to the modern world anymore, we do not know. So we need to kind of get all this out in the open and airing so that we can actually hold these conversations with knowledge.
Absolutely. You can't operate from a place of ignorance and make good decisions. And that has been one of the things that we have the point that we've made and argued this whole time is that we cannot, and again, this is of course a worldwide issue. This deals with us as a species, but speaking of someone here in the United States of America, we cannot expect members of Congress to properly legislate if the CIA and the Pentagon is hiding all of this from them. We cannot expect the President of the United States, doesn't matter if they're Democrat or Republican, to conduct proper foreign policy and conduct foreign policy from a place of knowledge if the Pentagon and the CIA hides it from half the presidents. You can't. It's not a fair expectation. So you're essentially tying one arm behind the back of the legislative branch and the executive branch by lying to them and hiding all of this from them. Sarah, thank you for the super chat. Tim Purvis, thank you for the super chat. Kim Anderson, thank you very much for the super chat. She says, "Thank you, guys. You're quite welcome." Todd T, again, thanks for the super chat. Malene, same thing. Just kind of scrolling through here. There was quite a bit, folks. We really appreciate your support, and closing
Matt,
thoughts.
can I jump in just on?
Please.
Yeah, I want to
go ahead,
actually just a continuing thought on the last note that we just brought up, which is during the anomalous health incidents public hearing, I believe it was in the House Armed Services Committee, maybe a week ago, or maybe it was the House or Senate. It was.
I think it was counterterrorism, but I could be wrong.
It was in that subcommittee. Mark Zaid, who you recently had on the program, Matt, made a comment that I think kind of speaks to what you're referring to here, which is in any number of subjects, the government is going to make a decision that's based on justifications to withhold information based on national security. But it is the role of Congress to check those justifications, right? To make sure that they actually make sense. And then if they don't, to do something about it. And they're being prevented from having the opportunity to even do that job of analyzing the justification for the withholding of the information from the American people. And fundamentally, if you apply that to any topic, like that's a core root in how our system works in the United States. We elect our members to Congress who are representatives of the people, and they then take the power we vested to them to then navigate and control the actions that occur by the executive branch who executes all the other. But that is effectively what we're hearing is non-existent. That system of checks and balances doesn't exist, probably not only in the UAP topic, but in several of these allegedly sensitive national security, adjacent subject matters. And that is fundamentally something that needs to be addressed, period, full stop, regardless of the origins of UAP. That cannot happen because we're not functioning as a democracy as was set out by our founding fathers, if that is allowed to continue to transpire. It's a fundamental governing problem, let alone a specific UAP issue.
Dan, what are your thoughts on that as someone that is in the United Kingdom? You're a democracy as well. What do you think about all of that?
I mean, so I'm not a big believer that in the UK we have, freedom of speech in the same way as you guys kind of talk about it and have it. During the whole Edward Snowden thing and the Panama Papers and all of these things that happened, journalists were coming into the country and getting their hard drives smashed up, even though the people that were breaking these hard drives knew that this information was in the cloud already and it would make no difference. They still chose to act like, authoritarians and tell us the information that we can discuss. It's essentially treating society like children. There's a really cool concept referred to as turkey scientists. And if you imagine a turkey coop, and for 364 days a year, everything's great, right? They live, they eat, they kind of let out in the morning, and all goes well. And then one day a year, the farmer comes in and takes one of them. Imagine if the rest of them weren't allowed to talk about that one day a year. So they can't see the pattern. They can't see what's happening. So currently, we're essentially all turkey scientists in this situation. We don't know the pattern. Okay. We don't know the result. We don't know the initial conditions. And it's blinding us. And we're here trying to have this discussion as best we can with all of the muddy waters that come with this subject. And there are little moments of light like this where it feels like it can break through. And as I said earlier, if I was to send a member of, my local kind of council a 60-page document to kind of read, not interested. However, if I can send them a 10-second soundbite with someone with a resume as accomplished as Karl Nell, my God, they're going to have their world shaken. And I always hear that there's other stuff going on, so we can't discuss this. But there's always other stuff going on, and we need to start discussing this before we're on the other side of it going, I wonder if that could have gone differently.
Yep.
Yeah. There's always going to be some fire that needs to be put out. There is never going to be a good time, and we will get caught with our pants down if we do not address this 100%. It's a recipe for disaster. As Karl Nell said, it never pays to be reactive. We must, as a species, be proactive about this and insist from our government that they are proactive about this, that they come up with a plan, that they wrestle this away from the folks that are trying to hide it. The cat's out of the bag, and there's literally no turning back. But man. Well, guys, thank you. Thanks for joining us, Lester. What do you have coming up next, and how can folks support you at UAP Caucus?
Yeah, so definitely, you guys can go head over to UAPcaucus.com. We have a variety of materials on there. We've talked about it several times in the program. You can find me at Lester Nare on all socials, and we will be having a call campaign related to the recent work that you did, Matt, around protection for whistleblowers, specifically as it relates to the alleged death threats that are happening, which again, on the backdrop of Karl Nell now coming forward and saying the NHI presence is a real thing, it would, and part of the reason why they're hiding is the misdeeds. You would understand why there would be the potential pushback to folks who are trying to come forward and say something. So one of the things we can do right now is to support those whistleblowers in making sure that members of Congress actively work with the DOJ and the FBI, because we're talking about federal crimes here. We're not talking about, DOD, this and that. So this is something that they should be able to push Director Wray to make sure is investigated expeditiously.
Dan, how about yourself? How can folks follow what you are up to on this topic?
So you can follow me at social media at thesignal.com, or see me over at that UFO podcast. But more importantly, it is my birthday tomorrow. And that is not important because I'm having a great day. I have a request from people. For my birthday, what I would like you to do is to take 5 minutes out of your day. You can do this with a cup of coffee. Go to Lester's website and send one person, one official, whether it's local or otherwise, a letter asking them to pay attention to this, to take this seriously. Even if it's one paragraph, if it's one sentence, just do that for me, please. Please. That's all I'm asking for my birthday, is just get in touch with an official and tell them to take this seriously.
Folks, you heard it right from the horse's mouth. This gentleman has a big birthday tomorrow, and what better birthday gift to give to Dan Zetterstrom here than to get out there, let people know exactly call your representatives, let them know this has to be rectified. That's for sure. Well, gentlemen, I really appreciate you coming on. As I mentioned, this whole show we threw together at literally like 2 to 3 hours before this whole thing was coming on. It just kind of came to me this morning. It's like, we need to cover this thing. And Lester and Dan, I really appreciate you guys coming on. And I want to especially thank our chat moderators who just came out of the woodwork to take care of this. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Matt. It's a pleasure as always.
All right, thank you.
Thank you,
guys. All I have to say is, if for those of you that maybe questioned what David Grusch had to say at the congressional hearings last year, I mean, they were truly groundbreaking, truly shocking. The revelations that elements of the government, particularly the Pentagon and the CIA, have been covering this up the whole time, lying to Congress, lying to the executive branch, and it was literally a mic drop moment when Karl Nell said flat out that a non-human intelligence is here on Earth, observing us, interacting with us, and as I mentioned earlier, the amount of the bona fides of what Colonel Nell has in terms of his career and everything that he has done. This is the man that has the security clearances, the tickets. You can tell just by the multiple national security positions that he's held that this guy knows what he's talking about. He is not pulling this out of thin air. It is the same can be said for whistleblowers such as David Grusch, who handled presidential classified material on a daily basis. This is not somebody that is just making up stuff. And you've heard this coordinated disinformation campaign from the Pentagon and the CIA that all of this is just a bunch of UFO fanatics that have managed to convince Congress that all of this is going on. At the end of the day, members of Congress, particularly as was he referenced to on the Senate side that are on Senate Armed Services Committee, that are on Senate Armed Services Committee and Senate Intel Committee. These are all folks that are privy to the intelligence product. They know very well that this is going on, that it is something that the Pentagon and the CIA has been covering up, lying to Congress. And we have seen time and time again, especially recently, this concerted effort by the Pentagon to spread disinformation not only to the American public, but to Congress in an effort to get Congress to stop looking into this. So when you hear about Lue Elizondo talking about death threats and harassment and whistleblowers that have received this kind of harassment, folks, we live in a democracy where this kind of stuff is not supposed to be happening. When you have a group of 50-ish non-elective senior executive service level employees calling the shots that have been managing and been gatekeeping this whole thing for decades, multiple people obviously coming through to handle this, lying to you, the American voter, to Congress, and to the executive branch. That is not what the founding fathers intended for our country, and it is absolutely unconscionable that this is going on and that this continues to go on. And we saw with the coordinated disinformation campaign with Arrow. And many of the major news outlets, New York Times, Washington Post, and the surprising coordination with the debunkers, essentially spouting off the same kind of garbage that and conspiracy theories that you had people like Stephen Greenstreet of the New York Post throwing out into the ether. You had the former director of the Pentagon's UFO program, Arrow, the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, saying the exact same thing. So it is illegal for the CIA, who is the portfolio holder of the UAP UFO issue. They have been for literally decades. It is illegal for them and the Pentagon to be engaging in any sort of psychological warfare operation on the American people and members of Congress. But at the end of the day, that is their intent. The intent of the debunkers, people like Mick West and others that seemingly do this for a living, their intent, the intent of the Pentagon Public Affairs Office, the intent of the CIA is to spread all of this, throw up all of this chaff, all of this dust, to spin this narrative that Congress is wasting taxpayer dollars looking into this. They want the American voter to call up their elected officials and say, why are you spending money on this? Why are you spending my taxpayer dollars on this? And at the end of the day, that is their intent. They do not want us to ask questions. They do not want Congress to ask questions. The CIA and the Pentagon are purposely avoiding congressional oversight because they do not want to be held accountable for past criminal deeds that they have engaged in for, since all of this started back, in probably the 40s. There is a significant amount of criminal liability on the part of the Pentagon, the CIA, and other elements of the United States government that has conducted themselves in a way that flies in the face of democracy. It flies in the face of the Constitution of the United States, and really it flies in the face of human decency. Very early on, I had Senator Kirsten Gillibrand on the Good Trouble Show, and I don't have a quote in front of me, but essentially what she said is that it is not the Pentagon's place, it is not the government's place to decide for all of us whether we be told about our place in the universe. It is not the Pentagon's place. It is not the CIA's place to cut backroom deals that are hidden from Congress, that are hidden from the American people. It is not the Pentagon's place, it is not the CIA's place to decide for all of us, on all of our behalf, if there was some kind of agreement that was agreed upon between our government, or this element of the government that essentially has been running rogue, and whatever this is that is interacting with us. I mean, I have no idea where it's from, but Colonel Karl Nell explicitly stated, as has David Grusch, former high-ranking intelligence official David Grusch, as has Lue Elizondo, former director of the Pentagon's UFO program ATIP. They have all stated unequivocally, this is happening, this is here, this is worldwide, and this is something that all of us as a nation, all of us as a species must confront head on. And we cannot do that until the Pentagon and the CIA ceases to lie to Congress and the American people. That is the only way that is going to happen. And and it's up to all of us. People say all the time, well, what can I do? Do I need a podcast? Do I need a show? Whatever. No. All you need is your voice. All you need is to look up who your congressional representative is and call them and tell them that this is absolutely unacceptable. It is un-American. It is un-American to have literally the Central Intelligence Agency running rogue, flying in the face of what it means to be an American. It is illegal for the Pentagon to have their public affairs office running disinformation campaigns against the American people to try and influence Congress. It is un-American. It is a perversion of democracy. When you have the Central Intelligence Agency and the Pentagon continually lying to you at home and lying to members of Congress, it is nothing short of a perversion of democracy, and it is at its core absolutely un-American. And we cannot and should not be standing for this. We deserve better, and frankly, everyone in the world deserves better than to be just flat out lied to by elements of our government that seemingly are behaving as if they operate as a military junta, which that's not the America that I want to believe that we live in, and that's not the democracy that we live in. And the fact that on our chat you had debunkers and obvious bots from the intelligence community trying to derail discussion in the chat. We had that exact same thing happen when we had the exclusive statements from Lue Elizondo, and we had never had anything to that level in our chats. Nothing even close. We had Mick West come in a day before to try and I think be disruptive in the chat. We had to mute him because people were paying more attention to what he was saying and the noise he was trying to create in the chat than listen to what our guests have to say. But when you hear these debunkers talk, when you hear Mick West talk, or this Lou Angeles guy, this probably out-of-work actor in L.A., or Stephen Greenstreet, who is a video editor for the New York Post, who has actually worked on psychological operations on behalf of the State Department, when you stop and you listen to what they have to say, and you really stop and think about what the narrative that they are trying to spin, which is this kind of magical thinking based on conspiracy theories, versus people such as Colonel Karl Nell, who have worked in the national security establishment for literally decades. When you hear former high-ranking intelligence official David Grusch talk about all of this, somebody that has held some of the nation's highest security clearances and the associated tickets. Lue Elizondo, same thing. A guy that has given everything for this country and sacrificed everything for this country. When you listen to the debunkers and the garbage that they spew, and it is literal garbage, it is disinformation. And I'm not talking about skeptics that say, you know what, maybe this UFO video may be may not be real or whatever. I'm talking about debunkers, professional debunkers that do this for a living, for financial compensation. They rely on programs such as this to keep their content alive, because they are there to sow confusion, to sow disinformation, to carry the water of the Pentagon and the CIA. Keep that in mind and think about when you're hearing this stuff from Mick West and Lou Angeles and all these other clowns. These are folks that have not served the country. They have not done anything for the country. They have probably not worn the uniform. Versus Lue Elizondo, David Grusch, Colonel Karl Nell, and others that have sacrificed for their country, that are not doing this for any kind of financial gain. They are doing it because they understand that there is a cancer that is spread throughout the Central Intelligence Agency and the Pentagon. A cancer that is lying to Congress, that is avoiding congressional oversight. So when you look at this group of people that is trying to sow all of this chaff and disinformation, think about what their true intentions are versus these American patriots that have put themselves and their families before put their country before themselves and their families. It just goes to show you there are people that are truly wanting the truth, such as David Grusch, Colonel Karl Nell, Lue Elizondo, and others that are fighting to get this out. Former Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence Christopher Mellon and others that have gone to the mat to get you, the public, doesn't matter if you're in America or wherever in the world, to get you the truth and to tell all of you that it is up to you to demand from your government that this stops, and it stops right now. Because if we don't, we are going to find ourselves not only as a nation, but as a species. We're going to be caught with our pants down, and it's not going to go well. There is no reason for this level of obfuscation and disinformation and lack of planning and burying their head in the sand about this reality. There's absolutely no justification about this. And finally, I want to say this. You know, last November, myself, Josh Boswell, and Christopher Sharp, we all three of us wrote this article for the Daily Mail that detailed how exactly the Central Intelligence Agency had been running this entire UAP UFO crash retrieval and back engineering operation. And we explained exactly who was running it in terms of what department, that this was running out of the Directorate of Science and Technology, that a super secret element of the government, you can find it in very small mentions on the web, called the Office of Global Access, which has now been renamed something else within the CIA. But that this entire organization has been running this back engineering or crash recovery and back engineering program and hiding it from Congress. We spoke about how the Joint Special Operations Command, which is who runs the Navy SEALs and all of that, how there was essentially a rogue group of former JSOC operators being run out of the Office of Global Access to engage in kinetic retaliation against anybody that threatened to expose the entire crash retrieval back engineering operation and the associated black programs, the unacknowledged and waived special access programs. So you have to ask yourself, when you hear from people like Lue Elizondo that people are being threatened, whistleblowers are being threatened with their lives when people are being threatened by these groups, former JSOC operators, security contractors that are working for the aerospace corporations that have a humongous financial stake in all of this. I cannot think of something that rises to a level of felony criminal behavior than that. When you as a journalist are told that your show is being noticed by very important people in DC and that you need to really be conscious of what you're saying and to essentially watch your back, that is not the America any of us should be living in. It's un-American. It's a perversion of democracy. And when you have folks that are willing to put themselves on the line, put their personal safety and their families on the line to get this out and rectify essentially a constitutional crisis, and they are being threatened, it's damn time Congress hold congressional hearings, church committee, church commission type hearings, put people under oath. There needs to be a reconciliation process, and as I've stated time and time again, there are good people in the CIA, there are good people in Nare, there are good people in the Pentagon. But in all of those organizations, there is a cancer that continues to metastasize with this topic. And it is high time Congress confront it. It is high time that Congress restore their constitutional duty of oversight of the Pentagon, of the CIA, of these organizations. And the only way that is going to happen is for all of you at home that are watching is to call up your representatives and demand that this stop. That all of us as Americans, all of us, no matter what country you live in, we are mad as hell and we are not going to take it anymore.